Sergeant Frank Kowalski's hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the wrench, and it wasn't from the cold. 50 tanks. 50 goddamn Sherman tanks sitting in the Belgian mud like steel coffins, and the Germans were coming at dawn. He could hear it in the way Lieutenant Morrison's voice had cracked during the briefing, see it in the hollow eyes of every man in the motor pool. They all knew what 50 disabled tanks meant. It meant the line would break. It meant the boys in the foxholes 3 miles east would be overrun. It meant widows and gold stars, and letters that began with, "We regret to inform you." The rain hammered down on the canvas roof of the makeshift repair depot, a relentless percussion that had turned the entire Belgian countryside into a sea of freezing mud. Frank stood in the center of what used to be a farmer's barn, now crowded with scattered tools, oil drums, and the desperate energy of men who'd been working for 16 hours straight. The smell was overwhelming. Motor oil, wet wool, cigarette smoke, and the sharp metallic tang of fear that no amount of rain could wash away. "Sarge, we got maybe 12 running. 13 if Paulson can get that fuel line sorted." Corporal Eddie Chen appeared at his elbow, his face streaked with grease and exhaustion. The kid was 22, but looked 40 in the harsh light of the work lamps strung across the rafters. "The rest? I don't know, Frank. The transmissions are shot to hell. We'd need a week. We got maybe 6 hours. 6 hours until the panzer divisions that had been massing in the Ardennes forest made their push. Intelligence had been clear about that much, at least. 6 hours until American boys with nothing but rifles and prayers faced German armor." Frank closed his eyes and saw his daughter's face. Sarah. She'd be 7 now. He hadn't seen her since he shipped out, hadn't held his wife Mary since that morning at the train station in Pittsburgh when she'd pressed a photograph into his hand and told him to come home. The photo was in his breast pocket now, creased and worn, her handwriting on the back faded but still legible. "We're waiting for you." "Sarge?" He opened his eyes. The barn was organized chaos, mechanics crawling under tanks, welders sending showers of sparks into the darkness, runners sprinting between vehicles with parts and tools and increasingly desperate messages. 37 men working miracles, and it wasn't enough. "Get everyone together," Frank said quietly. 5 minutes. Eddie's eyes widened. "Everyone? Frank, we can't stop working." 5 minutes, Eddie. Everyone." The corporal hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the mechanical maze. Frank walked to the open barn doors and stared out into the rain. Beyond the depot, he could see the dark shapes of the disabled Shermans arranged in rough rows across the muddy field. 38 tanks that might as well be sculptures. Each one represented 5 men: commanders, gunners, drivers, loaders, bow gunners. 190 soldiers who would go into battle tomorrow in machines that wouldn't move. Or wouldn't come back at all. The sound of boots on wet ground announced Lieutenant Morrison's arrival. The officer was younger than Frank by a decade, a college boy from Boston who'd gotten his commission 6 months ago and still flinched at the sound of artillery. But his eyes were steady as he approached. "Sergeant Kowalski, status?" "Calling a meeting, sir. Need to talk to the men." Morrison's jaw tightened. "We don't have time for meetings. We have orders to get every possible tank. With respect, Lieutenant, we have orders we can't follow." Frank turned to face him. "Not the way we've been doing it." For a long moment, they stood in the rain, 2 men carrying the weight of decisions that would ripple through dozens of lives. Finally, Morrison nodded. "Make it quick." The mechanics gathered slowly, reluctantly abandoning their posts. They formed a loose semicircle inside the barn, 37 men in oil-stained coveralls and drenched uniforms. Frank recognized each face. There was Jimmy Rodriguez from El Paso, who could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone. Big Tommy Kowalczyk from Detroit, who'd been a foreman at the Ford plant and could organize a work crew like nobody's business. Young Paulson, barely 18, who cried in his sleep and worked like a man possessed during the day, as if he could weld his nightmares into silence. Frank climbed onto an empty oil drum so everyone could see him. The rain was louder now, drowning out everything except the occasional clank of metal and the distant rumble that might have been thunder, or might have been something worse. "I'm not going to lie to you," he began, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "We're not going to get these tanks fixed, not all of them, not by dawn. Someone cursed. Another man kicked at the dirt floor, but no one argued. They all knew. We've been working the way we always work, one tank at a time, doing it right, making sure each repair holds. That's how mechanics operate. That's how we were trained. He paused, letting the words settle. But we're not mechanics tonight. We're soldiers, and soldiers find a way. Eddie stepped forward. What are you saying, Sarge? Frank pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. The depot inventory he'd been staring at for the past hour. The numbers that had been driving him slowly insane. But now, looking at those numbers through different eyes, he'd seen something. Something ridiculous. Something that might actually work. We've been trying to fix 38 broken tanks, he said slowly. What if we don't? Confused murmurs rippled through the group. Morrison moved closer, frowning. What if, instead, Frank continued, we strip parts from the worst tanks, the ones that would take days to repair, and use those parts to get the rest running? We're not trying to make them perfect. We're trying to make them move. Just get them to the line. That's... Paulson started, then stopped. That's field cannibalization. We'd be destroying half the tanks to save the other half. Not destroying. Harvesting. Frank looked around at the faces, seeing the idea take hold. We got 23 tanks that are close. Just need 1 or 2 parts. We got 15 that are completely shot. So we sacrifice the 15. Take their transmissions, their drive sprockets, their bogie wheels. We turn this into an assembly line. Half of us strip parts, half of us install. We work in teams, we work fast, and we work through the night. Tommy was nodding now, his mechanic's mind already running the calculations. We'd need to prioritize which tanks get saved. Most critical repairs first. And we'd need, Jesus, Sarge, we'd need perfect coordination. One mistake, and we waste parts on the wrong tank. Then we don't make mistakes. Frank's voice hardened. I know what I'm asking. I know we're trained to save every vehicle, to never give up on a machine. But tonight, we give up on 15 to save 35. That's 175 tankers who get to fight tomorrow instead of 90. That's the line holding instead of breaking. The silence was absolute now. Every man was doing the same brutal math, weighing the choice against every instinct they had as mechanics. Rodriguez spoke up, his voice rough. My cousins in the 7th Armored. They're holding the northern sector. He met Frank's eyes. If the line breaks, his unit gets flanked. My brother's infantry, someone else added. 3rd Battalion. One by one, they spoke. Brothers, cousins, friends from basic training, guys from the same hometown. The war wasn't abstract anymore. It was family and faces and names written in letters tucked in footlockers. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward. This isn't standard procedure, Sergeant. If command finds out we deliberately destroyed 15 tanks, then I'll take the court-martial, sir. Frank's voice was steady. But those boys in the foxholes won't care about procedure when armor shows up to support them instead of leaving them to die. Morrison stared at him for a long moment. Then, incredibly, the young officer smiled. A thin, grim smile that made him look older, harder, like the war had just carved away another piece of his youth. Do it. I'll handle command. He raised his voice to address the group. You heard the sergeant. Strip teams and install teams. We're running an assembly line operation. Most critical repairs first. We have 6 hours to pull off the most ridiculous thing anyone's ever tried in this war. Let's make it work. The transformation was immediate. The scattered, desperate energy focused into something sharp and purposeful. Tommy started organizing teams, his foreman experience kicking in. Rodriguez and 3 others sprinted to the condemned tanks with cutting torches and wrenches. Eddie grabbed a clipboard and started mapping out which parts went where. Frank jumped down from the oil drum and found himself face to face with Paulson. The kid was pale, his eyes too bright. Sarge, what if we're wrong? What if we strip those tanks and still can't get enough running? Then we tried something instead of nothing, Frank said quietly, and maybe that's all we can do. He moved through the organized chaos, checking assignments, solving problems, making impossible decisions about which tanks lived and which died. The rain kept falling. The clock kept ticking. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the barn, history was holding its breath. By midnight, They had stripped 8 tanks down to their bones and gotten 6 others running. By 0200 hours, the number was 12 saved, 14 sacrificed. Men worked with bleeding hands and burning muscles, running on coffee and cigarettes and something deeper than endurance. Frank found himself standing beside Rodriguez as they wrestled a transmission out of a gutted Sherman. The metal was cold and heavy and streaked with mud. "You think it'll be enough?" Rodriguez grunted. "Has to be," Frank replied. "That's not an answer, Sarge. It's the only one I got." They carried the transmission together through the rain to a waiting tank, their boots squelching in the mud, their breath misting in the cold air. Around them, the night was alive with the sounds of desperate work, metal on metal, engines coughing to life, men shouting coordinates and measurements, and prayers disguised as curses. Dawn was coming. The Germans were coming. And 50 tanks were becoming 35, then 37, then 40. Frank didn't know if it would be enough. But as he watched his men transform impossibility into motion, watched them sacrifice and struggle and refuse to quit, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were going to try. At 0327 hours, Private Danny Paulson made a mistake that could have killed them all. He was under Sherman number 43, his hands numb from the cold, his vision blurred from exhaustion. When he cross-threaded the transmission mounting bolt, the wrench slipped. His knuckles slammed into the driveshaft housing, blood welled up immediately, black in the dim light of his work lamp. "Shit," he whispered, then louder, panicking. "Shit, shit, shit!" The bolt was jammed. The transmission, salvaged from tank number 12 after 2 hours of brutal work, hung at an angle, its weight supported only by a hydraulic jack that was already creaking ominously. If it fell, the transmission would shatter. They'd lose the part. They'd lose the tank. They'd lose time they didn't have. Paulson's hands were shaking so badly he dropped the wrench. It clanged against the metal floor of the tank's belly, the sound impossibly loud in his ears. He couldn't breathe. The space was too tight, too dark, too much like a coffin. He was going to fail. He was going to let everyone down. He was going to— "Paulson," Sergeant Kowalski's voice cut through the panic, calm and close. "Look at me, son." Frank had crawled under the tank beside him, his broad shoulders barely fitting in the cramped space. His face was streaked with grease and exhaustion, but his eyes were steady. "I can't—" Paulson's voice cracked. "Sarge, I fucked it up. You cross-threaded it. I see it." Frank's voice was matter-of-fact, no judgment, no anger. "Happens to everyone. Now we fix it. We don't have time. We got exactly as much time as we need. Breathe." Frank waited until Paulson sucked in a ragged breath. "Good. Again. Another breath. Now, I'm going to stabilize the transmission. You're going to back that bolt out slow and careful, not fast, not panicked, just steady. Can you do that?" Paulson nodded, not trusting his voice. His hands were still shaking, but less now. Frank braced his shoulder against the transmission, taking the weight off the straining jack. His face went tight with effort, muscles bunching under his oil-stained uniform. "Do it now." Paulson gripped the wrench with both hands. Slowly, fighting against the damaged threads, he began to back out the bolt. Each turn felt like an eternity. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cold. Behind him, he could hear other mechanics working, other tanks roaring to life, the constant rhythm of salvation being hammered out one desperate repair at a time. The bolt came free. "Good," Frank grunted, still holding the transmission. "Now thread it right, straight in, no forcing." "Feel it catch?" Yeah, I got it." This time, Paulson's hands were steady. The bolt went in smooth, the threads catching perfectly. He tightened it down, checking the torque by feel, the way Rodriguez had taught him. "It's good, Sarge. It's solid." Frank lowered the transmission carefully onto its mounts and crawled out from under the tank. Paulson followed, emerging into the pre-dawn darkness that was somehow less suffocating than the belly of the Sherman. They sat in the mud for a moment, both breathing hard. "Thank you," Paulson said quietly. Frank clapped him on the shoulder. "Tank 43 is yours now. You broke it, you fixed it, it's yours. Get it running." He stood and moved on, already headed toward the next crisis, the next impossible problem that needed an impossible solution. Paulson watched him go, then turned back to his tank with something that felt almost like purpose. Across the field, the depot had transformed into something that looked less like a repair facility and more like a battlefield. The 15 condemned tanks sat in a row, skeletal now, stripped of everything useful: transmissions, drive wheels, tracks, even the periscopes and radio equipment. They looked like the corpses of mechanical beasts, picked clean by scavengers, but around them, the other tanks were coming to life. Corporal Eddie Chen stood in the center of the organized chaos with his clipboard, directing traffic like a conductor leading a symphony. He'd numbered each tank, assigned teams, created a rotation system that kept mechanics moving from vehicle to vehicle as needed. His voice was hoarse from shouting over the rain and engines, but his system was working. "Tommy, Tank 31 needs a final track alignment, then she's good." "Rodriguez, transmission install on 37 is taking too long. What's the holdup?" "Davidson, Murphy, get over to 41. They need help with the suspension." Big Tommy Kowalczyk was everywhere at once, his massive frame moving between tanks with surprising grace, checking welds, testing repairs, making sure nothing was done halfway. He'd been a quality control foreman at Ford, and he brought that same ruthless eye for detail to this midnight assembly line. "This weld is shit," he barked at a young private. "Do it again. I don't care if we're in a hurry. If it breaks during combat, you just killed 5 men. The private's face went pale. He grabbed the welding torch and went back to work, this time with fierce concentration. Lieutenant Morrison had positioned himself near the field telephone, maintaining contact with battalion headquarters and feeding them carefully edited updates. Frank had heard him on the line earlier, his voice crisp and confident. "Repair operations proceeding on schedule, sir. Expect significant number of vehicles operational by dawn." The lie was smooth, professional, and absolutely necessary. At 04:15 hours, they hit a wall. Tank number 28 needed a new drive sprocket, but the last available one had already been installed on Tank 33. Rodriguez came running to find Frank, his face desperate. "Sarge, we're out. We stripped every condemned tank. There's no more sprockets." Frank's mind raced. 28 was a command tank, equipped with better radio equipment than the standard Shermans. Losing it meant losing coordination capability for the entire company. "What about the tanks we already fixed? Can we pull one?" "We'd have to disassemble half the drivetrain. Take at least an hour, maybe 2. An hour they didn't have. Frank looked at the sky. The rain was tapering off, and the darkness was beginning to gray at the edges. Dawn was maybe 90 minutes away. The Germans would come with the light. "Fuck!" Frank ran his hands through his hair, leaving streaks of mud and oil. "Fuck, fuck, fuck, Sarge." Eddie had appeared at his elbow, his clipboard clutched to his chest. "I got an idea. It's stupid, but stupid is our specialty tonight. Talk. Tank 44, the one that threw a track yesterday during the road march. It's sitting about half a mile east, just off the main road. We towed it aside when it broke down, figured we'd come back for it later." Frank's eyes widened. "Does it have a good drive sprocket?" "Should." The problem was the track pins sheared off, not the drive system. Half a mile, in this mud, in the dark. Frank looked at the horizon again. "We'd need a recovery vehicle, a crew, tools." "I'll go," Rodriguez said immediately. "Give me 4 guys and the M26 tractor. We can have that sprocket back here in 40 minutes. 30, Frank corrected. "We need it in 30 if we're going to get it installed before dawn." Rodriguez grinned, fierce and wild. "Then we better run fast." 10 minutes later, Frank watched the M26 Dragon Wagon recovery tractor rumble out of the depot, Rodriguez and 4 mechanics hanging off the sides, tool bags clanking. The tractor's engine roared into the darkness, and then they were gone. Frank checked his watch. 0425 hours. Dawn at 0545. The recovery team would need to drive half a mile through mud, locate the disabled tank, remove the drive sprocket, and make it back. 30 minutes there and back, leaving almost no time for the actual repair work. It was going to be close. He turned back to the depot and found Morrison standing beside him. "Sergeant, we need to talk about the count." Frank's stomach tightened. "Sir?" I've been tracking the numbers. Even if Rodriguez gets that sprocket, even if every repair holds, we're going to have maybe 38, 39 tanks operational. We're still short. 39 running beats 12, Lieutenant. It's not enough. Morrison's voice was strained. I just got off the phone with Battalion. The German buildup is worse than we thought. They're estimating at least 2 panzer divisions, possibly 3. Our boys need every tank we can give them. Frank wanted to scream. They'd worked through the night, sacrificed 15 tanks, pushed 37 men to the edge of collapse, and it still wasn't enough. The universe was asking for more, and they had nothing left to give. There's one more tank, Morrison said quietly. Frank followed his gaze across the field to where a single Sherman sat apart from the others, untouched by the night's frantic work. Tank number 7. Frank's tank. When they'd arrived at the depot yesterday, Frank had been driving number 7. The engine was showing its age. The transmission was rough, but it ran. It had been one of the 12 operational tanks they'd started with. They'd left it alone because it didn't need repairs. No, Frank said. We need parts, Sergeant. That tank has a perfect transmission, a good engine, drive wheels that could save 2 other tanks. That's my tank, sir. And you're a mechanic, not a tanker. You don't need it. Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. But Private Dawson's crew does, and Corporal Martinez's crew. We can save 2 more tanks if we sacrifice yours. Frank turned away, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Tank number 7 had carried him through 3 months of combat. He'd named her Mary's Prayer and painted it on the hull in careful letters. He'd kept her running when other tanks died. He'd slept under her, bled on her, trusted her to bring him home. How many tanks if we use mine? He asked finally. 41, maybe 42. 42 tanks, 210 men, the line holding, his brothers in arms surviving another day. Frank closed his eyes and saw Sarah's face again. Saw Mary waiting at the train station. Thought about what he'd tell them when he got home. If he got home. Would he say he'd held back when men needed saving? That he'd kept his tank when others needed it more? Do it, he whispered. Strip her down. Morrison put a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of solidarity. I'm sorry, Sergeant. Don't be sorry, sir. Just make sure those tanks fight like hell. At 0453 hours, Rodriguez's team came screaming back into the depot, the M26's engine howling, the recovered drive sprocket tied to the tractor's winch. They'd made it in 28 minutes. At 0512 hours, the last bolt was tightened on tank number 28. At 0531 hours, Frank watched his own tank, Mary's Prayer, get carved apart by cutting torches, her transmission lifted out, her parts scattered to save others. At 0544 hours, as the first pale light touched the eastern horizon, Lieutenant Morrison stood on an empty ammunition crate and shouted across the field, "Start them up!" The sound was thunder. 42 Sherman tanks roared to life simultaneously, their engines bellowing defiance into the dawn. Black smoke belched from exhausts. Tracks clanked and settled. Radio static crackled as crews ran final checks. Frank stood in the center of the depot, his hands hanging at his sides, his body swaying with exhaustion. Around him, mechanics were embracing, crying, laughing with the kind of hysterical relief that comes after impossible pressure. Eddie was on his knees in the mud, his clipboard clutched to his chest. Tommy was openly weeping, his massive shoulders shaking. Young Paulson sat against the wheel of Tank 43, his face turned up to the gray sky, eyes closed. They'd done it. Against every odd, against every rule, against every reasonable expectation, they'd done it. Lieutenant Morrison appeared beside Frank, his uniform soaked with rain and oil and mud. 42 tanks, Sergeant. Ready for combat. Frank nodded slowly. His throat was too tight for words. In the distance, they heard the first rumble of artillery. The battle was beginning. And somewhere on that battlefield, 210 American tankers were climbing into machines that shouldn't exist, that had been saved by a ridiculous trick and the desperate courage of 37 mechanics who'd refused to quit. Frank thought about the 15 tanks they'd sacrificed. Thought about his own tank, Mary's Prayer, now scattered in pieces across the field. Thought about the price of salvation. Then he turned to his men and said the only thing that mattered: let's send them forward. The tanks rolled out at 06:02 hours, and Sergeant Frank Kowalski watched them disappear into the morning mist like iron ghosts returning to haunt a battlefield. He stood at the edge of the depot, his body numb from exhaustion and something deeper. A hollowness that came from giving away pieces of yourself until you weren't sure what remained. Around him, his mechanics had collapsed where they stood. Rodriguez sat against an oil drum, his head tilted back, asleep before he'd even closed his eyes. Big Tommy lay flat on his back in the mud, snoring like a chainsaw. Eddie Chen had made it as far as the barn before his legs gave out. He was curled on his side near the entrance, still clutching his clipboard. Only Frank remained standing, watching the last of the 42 Shermans vanish into the gray dawn. He could hear them, the deep rumble of engines, the clank and squeal of tracks, the metallic symphony of armor on the move. Each sound was a promise. Each tank carried 5 men who would live to see another sunset, because 37 mechanics had refused to accept the impossible. "Sergeant!" Lieutenant Morrison approached, moving like a man 20 years older than he was. His uniform was destroyed, torn, oil-stained, soaked through with rain and sweat and the residue of the longest night of his life, but his eyes were clear. "Battalion called. They want a full report on our unorthodox repair methods." Frank's laugh was bitter and short. "That's one way to put it. I told them we'd submit paperwork after the battle." Morrison pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offered one to Frank. They lit up, the smoke harsh and perfect in the cold morning air. "Also told them that without those tanks, the line would have broken. That seemed to buy us some time. How much trouble are we in, sir?" Morrison exhaled smoke, watching it drift away on the wind. "Depends on whether we win or lose. If those tanks help stop the German advance, we're heroes. If they break down mid-battle because we rushed the repairs—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Frank understood. They'd gambled everything, their careers, their reputations, possibly even their lives if someone wanted to charge them with destruction of military property. 15 tanks deliberately cannibalized, standard procedure thrown out the window. Orders bent so far they'd nearly broken. And all of it resting on whether their hasty, desperate repairs would hold under combat stress. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" "At this point, Sergeant, I think we're past formality. I'd do it again. Even knowing the risk, even knowing we might hang for it." Frank's voice was quiet but certain. "Those tankers deserved a chance to fight. We gave them that." Morrison nodded slowly. "I'd do it again, too." He dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "Get some rest, Frank. You've earned it." But Frank couldn't rest. Not yet. He walked through the depot, checking on his men, pulling blankets over the ones who'd collapsed in the cold, making sure everyone was accounted for. 37 mechanics, each one a hero who would never get a medal, never get their names in the paper, never have their story told. He found Paulson still sitting against Tank 43, awake now, staring at nothing. "You okay, kid?" Paulson looked up, his young face aged by the night's ordeal. "I keep thinking about that crew. The 5 guys who'll be fighting in this tank today. They don't know it almost didn't make it. They don't know I nearly fucked up and left them stranded. But you didn't." Frank sat down beside him in the mud. "You made a mistake, then you fixed it. That's all any of us can do. You think the repairs will hold? Really?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, watching the morning light strengthen over the Belgian countryside. In the distance, the artillery had grown louder, more frequent. The battle was intensifying. "I think we did the best we could with what we had. Sometimes that's enough, sometimes it's not. Either way, we tried." He stood up, his joints protesting. "Come on, let's get you some coffee and a place to sleep." The day passed in a strange, suspended kind of silence. The mechanics slept, or tried to sleep, their bodies shutting down now that the adrenaline had finally burned away. Frank dozed fitfully in the barn, his dreams full of wrenches and transmissions and the faces of men he'd never met, but whose lives depended on his work. He woke to the sound of Lieutenant Morrison's voice, urgent and sharp. "Kowalski! Frank, wake up!" Frank lurched to his feet, his hand automatically reaching for a weapon he wasn't carrying. What? What's wrong? Morrison's face was unreadable. Battalion just called. The tanks. We need to talk. Frank's stomach dropped. This was it. The repairs had failed. Tanks had broken down mid-battle. Men had died because of their gamble. The weight of that possibility pressed down on him like a physical thing, crushing his chest, making it hard to breathe. How bad? He managed to ask. Morrison stared at him for a heartbeat. Then, incredibly, he smiled. A wide, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. They held, Frank. Every single one of them held. The words didn't make sense at first. Frank's exhausted brain couldn't process them, couldn't accept that they might actually mean what they seemed to mean. What? The tanks. All 42. They're still fighting, still moving, still operational. Morrison grabbed Frank's shoulders. Your repairs held. The German advance hit our line at 0700 hours. Without that armor support, infantry would have been overrun in the first hour. But those tanks were there. They held the line. We're holding the line, Frank. Because of what you did. The barn suddenly seemed too small, the air too thin. Frank sat down hard on an ammunition crate, his hands shaking. Around him, the other mechanics were waking up, gathering around, sensing that something important was happening. Morrison raised his voice so everyone could hear. I just got off the phone with Colonel Henderson. He wanted me to pass along a message to the mechanics of the 47th Ordnance Battalion Motor Pool. He pulled out a piece of paper, reading from notes he'd scribbled during the call. He says, and I quote, "Tell those grease monkeys they pulled off the most insane, brilliant, and effective piece of field maintenance I've seen in 30 years of service. Tell them those tanks are fighting like lions. Tell them we're winning because they refuse to quit." The silence was absolute. Then Eddie Chen let out a whoop that echoed off the barn rafters. Tommy started laughing, deep belly laughs that shook his whole frame. Rodriguez was crying and cursing simultaneously in rapid-fire Spanish. Young Paulson just stood there, his face frozen in disbelief, as if afraid that believing would make it not real. Frank felt something break open inside him, the tension, the fear, the crushing responsibility he'd been carrying since yesterday. He put his face in his hands and felt his shoulders shake, not sure if he was laughing or crying, or both. There's more, Morrison continued. Battalion is sending up hot food, fresh coffee, and medical supplies. They're also extending our rest period. We're off duty for the next 48 hours. And... He paused, his smile widening. They're recommending several of you for commendations. Bronze stars for innovation under fire. Commendations? Rodriguez's voice was incredulous. I thought we'd be court-martialed. Turns out winning fixes a lot of procedural violations. Morrison folded his notes. Officially, our report will state that we employed creative field maintenance techniques to maximize operational readiness under combat conditions. The 15 tanks we cannibalized will be listed as combat losses, non-recoverable. Nobody needs to know exactly when they became non-recoverable. Frank looked up at the lieutenant. The young officer from Boston who'd started this night unsure and frightened had become something else. Someone who understood that rules existed to serve the mission, not the other way around. Someone who would lie to command to protect his men. Someone worth following. Thank you, sir. Morrison nodded. Thank you, Sergeant. All of you. You saved a lot of lives last night. The celebration that followed was quiet and exhausted, but genuine. Men shook hands, embraced, shared cigarettes, and the last of someone's hidden whiskey flask. They were too tired for anything loud or wild, but the relief was palpable, electric. A shared understanding that they'd stood at the edge of disaster and somehow stepped back. As evening fell, Frank found himself back at the edge of the depot, looking out over the field where the stripped tanks still sat like skeletons. 15 sacrifices that had saved 42. His own tank, Mary's Prayer, was among them. Just a hull now, gutted and empty. He pulled the photograph from his breast pocket. Mary and Sarah, frozen in a moment of Pennsylvania sunshine that felt like it belonged to a different world. The picture was more worn than ever, the edges soft from handling, but their faces were still clear, still waiting. "We did good today, Mary," he whispered to the photograph. "Gave up the tank, but saved the men. Think you'd approve of that trade." "Sarge?" Eddie Chen approached cautiously. "You doing okay?" "Yeah, kid. Just saying goodbye." Eddie looked at the stripped tanks, understanding. "Think they'll be mad? The guys who drove those tanks we cannibalized? When they find out what we did?" Frank considered that. "I think they'll understand. Every tanker knows the score. Sometimes you sacrifice the machine to save the men. That's always been the deal." "And your tank? Mary's prayer?" "She saved 42 crews today. Can't ask for a better last mission than that." Frank tucked the photograph back in his pocket. "Besides, tanks are just metal and oil. The guys inside them, that's what matters. We saved 210 soldiers today, Eddie. That's worth any number of tanks." They stood together in the gathering darkness, watching the stars begin to emerge from the clearing clouds. In the distance, the artillery had slowed. The battle was stabilizing. The line was holding. Tomorrow they would begin the work of repairing the damage, processing the losses, preparing for whatever came next. There would be investigations and reports and questions from officers who wanted to understand how 37 mechanics had achieved the impossible. There would be more battles, more desperate situations, more nights when winning seemed impossible. But tonight, for just a few hours, they could rest knowing they'd won. Frank turned away from the field and walked back toward the barn where his men were gathered. Rodriguez was teaching Tommy a card game. Paulson was writing a letter home, his hand steady now. Morrison was sharing the whiskey flask, telling stories that made the men laugh. This, Frank thought, was what they'd really saved. Not the tanks, not the machinery. But this, the moment after survival, when exhausted men could gather and laugh and remember that they were human, that they'd endured, that tomorrow they would still be here. He joined the circle, accepted the flask when it came his way, and let himself feel something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Somewhere on the front line, in 42 Sherman tanks held together by desperate repairs and mechanical prayers, 210 American soldiers were fighting. And because of what happened in a muddy Belgian depot during one impossible night, they were fighting in machines that moved, that protected them, that gave them a chance. That was enough. That had to be enough. Frank raised the flask in a silent toast to the stripped tanks in the field, to Mary's prayer and all the other sacrifices, to the ridiculous trick that had saved so many. Then he drank, and passed the flask, and let himself rest. 3 days after the tanks rolled out, they started coming back. Not all of them. Never all of them. Frank was working on a replacement engine for a half-track when he heard the first Sherman rumble into the depot. The sound made him freeze, wrench in hand, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He knew that particular engine note, the slightly rough idle that came from a hastily installed camshaft, the rattle in the exhaust that meant they'd used a salvaged manifold. Tank number 37. One of theirs. He dropped the wrench and ran. The Sherman rolled to a stop near the barn, its hull scarred with fresh bullet impacts and scorch marks from near misses. The crew emerged slowly, moving like old men despite being in their 20s. The commander was a lieutenant Frank didn't recognize, a tall kid with Mississippi in his voice and a bandage wrapped around his left hand. "You the mechanics?" the lieutenant asked, his voice hoarse. "Yeah," Frank managed. 47th Ordnance. We worked on your tank." The lieutenant looked at Tank 37 for a long moment, then back at Frank. His eyes were red-rimmed, haunted, but there was something else there too. Something that might have been gratitude or wonder, or maybe just exhaustion so profound it looked like emotion. "She took a hit from a Panzer IV at maybe 300 yards, he said quietly. "Shell hit the front glacis, right side. Thought we were done, but the armor held. The transmission kept running. We backed out of that kill zone and kept fighting." He paused, swallowing hard. "Whatever you guys did to this tank, however you fixed her, you saved our lives. All 5 of us." Frank couldn't speak. His throat had closed up entirely. Behind him, he heard footsteps as other mechanics emerged from the barn. Eddie, Rodriguez, Tommy, all of them drawn by the sound of returning armor. The lieutenant pulled something from his pocket, a small American flag, worn and stained with oil. Found this tucked in the engine compartment when we were doing field maintenance. Figured one of you left it there. He handed it to Frank. Want you to have it back. Something to remember what you did. Frank took the flag with shaking hands. He didn't remember putting it there. But maybe Rodriguez had, or Eddie, or one of the other mechanics during that frantic night. A small gesture of protection, of hope, of human connection hidden in the mechanical heart of a war machine. Thank you, he whispered. The lieutenant saluted, a crisp, formal gesture that felt like something more than military courtesy. Then he and his crew climbed back into their tank and rumbled away toward the maintenance area, leaving Frank standing with the flag clutched in his hands. Over the next 2 days, more tanks returned. 23 of the 42 made it back operational. 11 came back on recovery vehicles, damaged but repairable. 8 didn't come back at all. Each returning tank brought stories. Tank 43, Paulson's tank, the one he'd nearly ruined and then saved, had been part of a counterattack that broke a German probe into the American lines. The crew reported that the transmission had worked flawlessly through 16 hours of continuous combat. Tank 28, the command tank with the salvaged drive sprocket, had coordinated the entire defensive position. The radio equipment Frank had insisted on saving had kept 3 companies in communication during the crucial first hours of the battle. Tank number 14 had taken a direct hit to the turret. The commander died instantly, but the rest of the crew survived because the tank's mobility let them retreat to safety. They came back with their commander's dog tags and a message for the mechanics. He'd want you to know the tank you fixed gave us a chance to save him. We brought him home because of you. But there were losses too. Tank 9 had thrown a track in the middle of combat. One of Frank's hasty repairs failing under stress. The crew had to abandon her under fire. They all made it out, but the tank was captured by German forces and destroyed. Tank 18's transmission had failed completely, seizing up in the middle of a firefight. The crew fought from a disabled position for 3 hours before being overrun. 2 killed, 3 captured. Tank 31 had simply disappeared. No one knew what happened. She'd been there at the start of the battle, then vanished into the fog of war like a ghost dissolving into morning mist. Frank kept a notebook, writing down each tank's fate with precise, painful detail. Each success was a validation. Each failure was a weight added to his shoulders. The 8 that didn't return haunted him. 40 men whose survival had depended on repairs made in desperate haste during one impossible night. On the 4th day, Lieutenant Morrison found Frank sitting alone in the barn, the notebook open on his lap, staring at nothing. "Sergeant, we need to talk." Frank looked up, recognizing the tone. This was official business. "The investigation?" he asked flatly. Morrison nodded and sat down beside him. Colonel Henderson reviewed everything. The cannibalization of 15 tanks, the violation of standard maintenance protocols, the unauthorized field modifications. He paused. "He's writing it up as the single most effective field maintenance operation of the war." Frank blinked. "What?" "You heard me. He's submitting our entire motor pool for a unit commendation. Says what we did should be taught at every ordnance school in the Army." Morrison pulled out his own notebook, flipping through pages. "The math is pretty clear, Frank. We started with 12 operational tanks. Standard repair procedures would have gotten us maybe 20, 22 tanks operational by the time the Germans attacked. Instead, we put 42 into combat. Of those, 34 engaged the enemy effectively. The battle analysis shows that without that extra armor support, the line would have broken. Casualties would have been catastrophic." "What about the 8 we lost? The 40 men?" Morrison's voice gentled. "What about the 200 who came back? What about the infantry companies that held because they had tank support? What about the aid stations that didn't get overrun because the line held?" He leaned forward. "Frank, you can't save everyone. Nobody can. But you saved more than anyone had a right to expect." Frank looked down at his notebook, at the names and numbers that represented human lives balanced on the edge of mechanical possibility. Tank 9. Tank 18. Tank 31. 40 men who might have survived if he'd been more careful, more skilled, more lucky. "The crew from Tank 18, he said quietly. The two who died. They have families? One wife and a baby girl. One mother and 3 younger brothers. Frank nodded slowly, filing that information away in the growing catalog of debt he carried. I want to write to them. When this is over. Tell them what we did, why we did it. They deserve to know. They do, Morrison agreed. But Frank, you also need to know something. The commander of Tank 18, Lieutenant Carver. He wrote a letter before he died. His loader brought it back. It was addressed to the mechanics who fixed our tank. Want to hear what it said? Frank wasn't sure he did, but he nodded anyway. Morrison pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and read, To the mechanics who gave us a fighting chance. We rolled into battle knowing our tank had been fixed in a hurry. We could feel it, the rough edges, the not quite right sounds, the sense that this machine was held together by skill and prayer and not much else. But she ran. When we needed her most, she moved, she fought, she protected us. We knew that somewhere behind the lines there were men who'd worked themselves to exhaustion to give us this chance. We wanted you to know that we were grateful. Whatever happens, you did your job. You gave us a fighting chance. Can't ask for more than that. Respectfully, Lieutenant James Carver, Tank Commander. Morrison refolded the letter and handed it to Frank. He wrote that 2 hours before he died. His loader says he was calm, ready, grateful for the chance to fight. That's your legacy, Frank. Not the 8 tanks we lost, but the 42 crews who got to fight, who got to try, who got a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Frank took the letter with trembling hands. He read it again, slowly, feeling the weight of each word. A dying man's gratitude, a soldier's understanding that sometimes the chance to fight is all anyone can offer. Permission to be dismissed, sir? His voice was rough, barely controlled. Morrison stood and put a hand on Frank's shoulder. Go get some air, Sergeant. That's an order. Frank walked out of the barn into the late afternoon sunlight. The depot was busy again. Tanks coming and going. Mechanics working on battle damage. The normal rhythm of war resuming after those few desperate days. The 15 stripped tanks had been hauled away, their carcasses recycled into the vast industrial machine that fed the war effort. Even Mary's prayer was gone now, reduced to spare parts scattered across a dozen different vehicles. He walked to the edge of the depot, to a spot where he could see across the Belgian countryside toward the front lines. The artillery was quieter now. The immediate crisis had passed. But somewhere out there, men were still dying, tanks were still burning, and the war ground forward with indifferent momentum. Frank pulled out the photograph of Mary and Sarah, along with Lieutenant Carver's letter. He looked at both, his reason for surviving and a stranger's reason for being grateful while facing death. Hey, Sarge. He turned to find his entire crew approaching. Eddie, Rodriguez, Tommy, Paulson, and all the others. 37 mechanics who'd shared one impossible night and now carried the memory of it like a badge of honor and a burden of responsibility. Rodriguez spoke first. We heard about the commendation, about the colonel's report. Wanted to make sure you were okay. I'm fine, Frank said automatically, then stopped. These men deserved better than automatic responses. No, I'm not fine. We lost 8 tanks, 40 men, 2 of them dead. That's on us. That's on the war, Tommy countered, his deep voice firm. We did what we could with what we had. The ones who made it back, they know that. The ones who didn't. He paused, struggling with words. They got a chance to fight, Frank. In machines that moved, that protected them as long as possible. That's what we gave them. That's all anyone can give in this hell. Eddie stepped forward. I've been doing the math, Sarge. Real careful math. Based on historical data, typical combat effectiveness, expected failure rates, all of it. He pulled out his ever-present clipboard. If we'd followed standard procedures, gotten 22 tanks operational instead of 42, the projected casualty rate for the battle would have been 68% higher. That's not a guess. That's math. We saved lives, Frank. More lives than we lost. But we did lose some, Paulson added quietly. And that matters too. We're not celebrating. We're not pretending it was perfect, but we're also not forgetting that we gave everything we had to save as many as possible. Frank looked at these men, these mechanics who'd become brothers during one desperate night, and felt something shift inside him. They were right. The guilt and the grief were real and valid, but so was the pride and the accomplishment. He could carry both. He had to carry both. "Thank you," he said simply. "For everything. For that night. For now, for understanding." Rodriguez grinned. "We're mechanics, Sarge. We understand that sometimes things break. Sometimes despite your best work the metal fails. But you keep trying anyway. You keep fixing things. You keep giving people a chance. Besides," Tommy added with a slight smile, "you think we could let you stand out here alone, beating yourself up? We're a crew. We carry this together." They stood in a loose circle as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the Belgian fields. In the distance, a convoy of trucks rolled past, carrying supplies forward and wounded back. The war continued its ancient rhythm, indifferent to individual suffering or small miracles. But for these 37 men, for this one moment, there was peace. "I'm writing letters," Frank announced suddenly. "To the families. The ones we lost and the ones we saved. They should know what happened that night. What their sons and husbands and brothers were part of." "We'll help," Eddie said immediately. "We were all there. We all have things to say." "Yeah," Rodriguez agreed. "Every crew, every tank. They should know the whole story." Frank nodded, feeling lighter somehow. The burden was still there. It would always be there. But now it was shared, distributed among brothers who understood. As darkness fell, they walked back to the barn together. Inside, someone had started a small fire in an oil drum for warmth. Coffee was brewing. Someone else had scrounged up bread and cheese for a late meal. The mechanics gathered around the fire, swapping stories, sharing silence, existing in that space that soldiers occupy between battles. Not quite peace, not quite war, but something uniquely their own. Frank sat with Lieutenant Carver's letter and his photograph of Mary and Sarah, and he began to write. Letter after letter, to families he'd never met, about sons they'd lost or sons they'd gotten back. He wrote about one impossible night and 37 mechanics and 42 tanks held together by skill and desperation and something that might have been faith. He wrote about sacrifice and survival, about the machines they'd saved and the ones they'd given up. He wrote about Private Danny Paulson's mistake and redemption, about Corporal Eddie Chen's organizational genius, about Rodriguez's mad dash for a drive sprocket in the darkness. He wrote about his own tank, Mary's prayer, and how sometimes you save lives by letting go of the things you love. And as he wrote, surrounded by his crew, warmed by fire and coffee and brotherhood, Frank Kowalski understood something fundamental. They'd pulled off something ridiculous. Something that shouldn't have worked. Something that violated every rule and procedure and sensible approach to mechanical repair. But they'd done it anyway. And because they'd tried the impossible, 210 men had gotten a chance to fight, to survive, to maybe make it home. That was the story worth telling. Not a story of perfect victory, but of imperfect humans doing everything they could with what they had, accepting both the triumphs and the losses, and refusing to stop trying even when success seemed impossible. In the morning, there would be more tanks to fix, more battles to support, more impossible situations that demanded ridiculous solutions. But tonight, they could rest knowing they'd faced the impossible and found a way through. Frank sealed the last letter and looked around at his mechanics, these ordinary men who'd done something extraordinary. "Thank you," he said to all of them, "for one hell of a night." Rodriguez raised his coffee cup. "To the night of 50 ghosts." 50 ghosts, the others echoed, raising their own cups. And in a muddy Belgian depot, surrounded by the machinery of war, 37 mechanics drank to the memory of one impossible night when they'd saved the world, one desperate repair at a time. The war would continue. More battles would come. But they would face them together, carrying the knowledge that when everything was on the line, when the impossible became necessary, they'd found a way. They'd always find a way. That was the promise they made to each other in that moment, not spoken aloud, but understood completely. As long as there were tanks that needed fixing and lives that needed saving, they would try. And sometimes in war, trying is the only victory that matters. The end. In memory of all the mechanics, maintenance crews, and support personnel who served in the shadows of World War II, performing daily miracles that kept the machines of war running, and gave soldiers the chance to fight, to survive, and to come home. Your work was never glamorous, rarely recognized, but absolutely essential. This story is for you.